Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and in this video I'm going to continue my discussion on Jose Ortega y Gasset's The Revolt of the Masses. I've been doing a chapter-by-chapter analysis of Jose Ortega y Gasset's The Revolt of the Masses, and in this discussion I'm going to continue with Chapter 7. In my last discussion in Chapter 6, we went through and we talked about the masked man. What are the characteristics of the masked man? How do we come to understand what the masked man is? And address sort of the paradox and the paradoxical nature of both being masked and man. How he rises to his power and so on. In this discussion, the title of Chapter 7 is Noble Life and Common Life, or Effort and Inertia. So, Noble Life and Common Life, or Effort and Inertia. So, Noble Life and Common Life, or Effort and Inertia. And the question that we're going to ask ourselves in Chapter 7 that Gasset concerns himself with is what does he mean by effort, what does he mean by inertia, and how do these sort of terms that are usually used in like physics incorporated into his theoretical account? How does he incorporate the idea of effort? How does he incorporate the idea of inertia into his account of nobility and common life? And also, where does this concept of nobility come from, right? Because until now, we haven't really had a discussion on nobility. We've had a discussion on aristocracy, but we haven't had a discussion on nobility. Okay. First, a few points of clarification before we begin. The first thing to recognize in Chapter 7, Gasset is not, and nor should you, conflate aristocracy with nobility. He means two different things by aristocracy and nobility. To say that the aristocracy mentioned in previous chapters is the same as the nobility mentioned in Chapter 7 is incorrect. Aristocracy previously has always referred to sort of the apex of this three-tiered social hierarchy. The lowest being the minority, the masses in the middle, the aristocracy at the top. That's not what he means by nobility, and we'll see what he means by nobility in this section. Also, what he does in Chapter 7, Gasset does in Chapter 7, a little bit, is he continues the discussion of the masked man. What is the masked man? We saw in Chapter 6, we went through sort of like 8 or 9 criteria of what the masked man was. He does a little bit more explanation of what the masked man is and how he's defined in this chapter. But more importantly, what he talks about is how the masked man came to be in this chapter, and sort of what are the social and historical conditions that allowed the masked man to come into existence. So with that said, I'm going to begin the analysis of Chapter 7. So the first point to make clear is that the point of the chapter, the goal of the chapter, is to distinguish the noble man from the masked man. So he introduces this idea of the nobleman, and the nobleman, which he also calls the excellent man, and he distinguishes this from the masked man. So we need to know, we know what the characteristics of the masked man are. I went through that in the analysis of Chapter 6. In this chapter, what I'm going to do is analyze the characteristics and the features of the nobleman or the excellent man, and then we'll have a greater means of comparing the masked man from the nobleman and seeing what he means by the nobleman. Okay, in Chapter 7, Gasset recognizes that there is a refusal to accept, by the masses, there's a refusal to accept obligation, right? So that there is a sense in which, in previous chapters, we've talked about social obligations. They're duties that individuals have to do. And what we've recognized, according to Gasset, is that in the 19th century, we've done away with this idea of obligation, this idea of duty, and we've supplanted that idea of duty with rights, right? And technically speaking, there is a relationship, a very solid relationship between rights and duties. So that we can talk about rights and duties, and I'm not going to get into a very detailed analysis of this now. I might do another video on rights and duties later, but anytime we're talking about rights, we're also talking about duties, right? So that you're usually talking about rights and duties at the same time. So if someone has a right to X, if you say that someone has a right to X, then another person has a duty not to obstruct OBSTRU your right to X. So if you have a right to X, then someone else has a duty, a corresponding duty, not to obstruct your right to X, right? And this is what Gasset discusses in this chapter, sort of this idea, this distinction between rights and duties. He gets into quite a bit of detail into it. What he says is that the masked man has ascribed all these rights for himself, right? He has the right to X, Y, Z, all these rights. However, he's unwilling to recognize his corresponding duty to other people's rights. So if I have the right to X, someone else has the duty not to obstruct my right to that thing. But likewise, if someone else has a right to X, then I have a duty not to obstruct that other person's right to that thing. And what Gasset is doing in this chapter is saying that there's an imbalance, right? There's a sense of not being fair in discussing rights and duties for the masked man, so that the masked man recognizes only his rights and only the duties that others are obligated to him, but he refuses to have any corresponding obligations to others, right? And in such, this creates a very arrogant, a very malicious, a very ill-intended individual, because the individual is solely concerned with his or her pleasures, desires, and so on. Okay, so that hopefully shouldn't be too complicated. We've discussed similar ideas in previous chapters. To look at the example of this refusal to accept obligations, you can look at the following. Gasset says in the following, he says, "It is for this reason that I stress so much the observation that the world into which the masses of today have been born displays features radically new to history. Whereas in past times, life of the average man meant finding all around him difficult, dangers, want, limitations of his destiny, dependency. The new world appears as a sphere of practically limitless possibilities, safe and independent of anyone. The new voice shouts, to live is to meet with no limitations whatsoever, and consequently to abandon oneself calmly to oneself. Practically nothing is impossible, nothing is dangerous, and in principle, nobody is superior to anybody." Okay, what does that mean? Well, the thing to recognize that Gasset is attempting to do immediately is that he talks about this sense of obligation, right? The individual, the masses, are unwilling to obligate themselves to any idea, any other person, right? They see their cause, their objectives as paramount. And any other objective, any other cause is immediately subordinate, right? So you can look at it like this. If you have two sort of spheres of existence, you have the old way, we'll call this one the old way, and by that Gasset means pre-18th century. So from the beginning of human civilization up until the 18th century. And then we have the new way, and this is from the 19th century onward, right? So the old way is up until the 18th century. The new way, and I'll just write the 18 in here, right? Before the up until the 18th century here, and then the 19th century here. The new masses that he's discussing is the masses from this era, right? In the 18th century, what Gasset says is that outside forces influence people of those times, right? They influence people of those times. The stress, the pressures of living, the day-to-day struggle, the oppression by others, the attempts to just meet baseline existence, to have an average existence, was much, much more difficult.